First, last item on the agenda is an application for a certificate of appropriateness of Borough of Manhattan, docket number 187634. This is 145 Perry Street, located within the Greenwich Village Historic District. It's a two-story garage, and the application is to demolish the existing building and to construct two new buildings.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Commissioners. Timothy Shaw, Preservation Staff. 145 Perry Street is located at the northeast corner of Perry and Washington Streets within the Greenwich Village Historic District. The application is for the demolition of the existing building here and for the construction of a new apartment building and a new townhouse. Bill Higgins of Higgins, Quaisbarth and Partners will begin the presentation.
Good afternoon, Commissioners and members of the public. Bill Higgins of Higgins Quaisbarth. I'd like to give you, if I may, some general background about the project and some context thinking and analysis that we've done, and that is very much figured into the development of the design that we're proposing. So as Tim said, the site is here in the far west village at the corner of Washington and Perry. And the project, which is completely as of right from a zoning point of view, we're not asking for any relief or special permits, etc. The project consists of two proposed buildings, a single-family residence and a closely related apartment house, and it is closely related. The project is being built and owned and occupied by members of the same family, including the parents in the house and the fortunate adult children in the apartment house. A general sense of the design, because I think it relates to the discussion of context. So the single-family residence has a multi-layer facade. It is a single facade, is meant to be experienced as one, but it is multi-layered. It has a brick exterior layer. It has an intermediate layer that is very heavily planted, landscaped. Then it has an inner layer which combines a bronze window system and terracotta in the vertical wall areas. Then, very consciously, the apartment house is designed so that it's almost as though the brick facade of the residence had been slid aside, and what is revealed behind it is a bronze facade which reflects the bronze and the tonality of that inner layer of the facade. So these are two buildings, but they were considered together, and they were consciously meant to be very closely related. Some historical background, as Tim mentioned. Here are 1930s views of the site. You may notice that there's this kind of cleared construction quality to the street. That's because they were getting ready to build the High Line, which was there until the 1990s. So although it is not there still, we do think that sort of in the memory of this site, part of our proposed materials palette of metal is reflecting that previous major structure on the site. So what there were 4-story, although of different heights, tenement buildings that are outlined here in white. Then in the late 1930s, this building was built, the existing building on the site, which has had multiple changes in the 70s and in the 90s and more recently than that. As I'll mention a little bit further on, the commission has approved 2 previous proposals for this site, and in both cases, the commission has approved the demolition of the existing building. So a bit of background, we took a close look at many aspects of the district, and particularly the areas right around where this site is. And we found that there's a really kind of diverse character to many aspects of the district. What we're looking for is inspiration, informing of a design that can really be appropriate to the entirety of the character of this district. I have to say that in the course of the public discussion of this project, which will continue today, this research has sometimes been interpreted as establishing that there's a lot going on in this area, therefore anything goes. That is not at all what we were thinking of. We were really looking for aspects of the context that would be useful. So with that in mind, a few things. The typology of the buildings and the residential buildings. Of course, the district and the context includes Greenwich Village brick row houses all the way through the various architectural styles. In some cases, they are as originally designed. In other cases, they have had alterations, changes in use, changes in openings, etc. There are apartment buildings that were actually built as apartment buildings. There were buildings that were built as commercial or industrial buildings that in many cases have been converted to residential use. So that conversion of industrial and commercial buildings to residential use is something that we also think can figure into the way an appropriate new building can be designed. Here is an existing commercial building in the district. Here is a new building recently approved by the commission in recent years, which, although residential, clearly reflects a lot of the characteristics of industrial and commercial buildings. Scale and context. There is a great variety of scale here. Again, from the detailed and delicate scale of early row houses, including the buildings and their stoops and areaways and railings, etc., to the commercial and industrial buildings, again, some of them retaining their commercial and industrial use, others having been converted to residential, where they have a different scale. But these scales are always juxtaposed. There is a multiplicity of them occurring together and creating, we think, the character of this particular part of the district. Again, a richness of materials. There is everything from stone to various colors of brick to terracotta, metals in various uses, some of them very traditional early architectural styles, others much more modern uses, including this building on Greenwich and this one in the district, but a bit farther away. That's the One Jackson Square building where the commission did approve a glass and metal building as appropriate. There is even some wood, and as you'll see, that too is reflected in the proposed design. The residential building, well, both buildings really, are designed with bases, very distinct bases. There's a variety of character and scale of bases in buildings, some of them being quite small and human-scaled row houses, others being larger in scale, both residential, the Village Nursing Home, and industrial buildings converted to residential. Brick color. Red brick row houses, of course, are very prevalent and very important and very much creators of the characteristic quality of this district. However, there are many, many examples of other hues and textures and colors of brick. So we feel that it has been appropriate to think across a spectrum of colors, not just red, in looking for an appropriate design proposal. I mentioned multi-layered facades being very much an integral part of this design, and this is something that is in the district. This building on Washington Street, I just personally think is a building that not enough people appreciate and pay attention to. It has a wonderful combination of original material, later material above that is obviously harmonious with the original, but also layering, where there are large openings infilled with later material, things going on behind them, plantings, decorative objects, railings. So when you look at a facade of a building like this, you're not just looking at its outer layer, you're looking at its full depth, and there's an extra layered richness to that. This happens in other places where often part of that depth is also planting that becomes part of the facade as well as part of the context. Large-scale openings. There are many large-scale openings to be found. Some of them are in industrial buildings that remain industrial and commercial. Others are in industrial and commercial buildings that have been converted, sometimes rather famously converted to residential use. So there is a considerable use of larger scale openings as well as smaller scale openings occurring together. Characteristics of windows. Some are individual windows in masonry openings. You also get these sort of system windows where, again, there's a real depth to the facade. Recessed within the masonry layer are these frame and spandrel, metal and glass systems which are very much a part of the district. So I'm coming to conclusion, but I think all of this is relevant. Just with respect to scale and appropriateness, a look at projects or proposals that the Commission has approved. This 2008 hotel approval. The broken red line is the outline of the building that we are proposing. So as you can see, what we're proposing is a bit smaller than the 2008 approval. Here's the 2009 multifamily residential approval, which is just about the same scale. So we are in a height range that the Commission has found appropriate for this site in the past. And here's my final slide, which just reinforces that point. Here is the Washington Street street elevation existing and proposed. There is the building on the site, and here is the proposed building. We're dealing with a 65-foot proposed height of the main block of the building, and then with rooftop bulkheads and planting and trellises, et cetera, we go to 80 and 83 feet. Both of the heights, the main height of the block of the buildings and the rooftop heights are very much within the range. They're a bit higher than some, and they're substantially lower than others. So we feel that we're in the range. I'm going to ask Mark Turkel of Leroy Street Studios to present. Thank you, Bill.
I'm going to start with the contextual elevations and then move through a series of slides that show the building and describe it in greater detail. This elevation slide that Bill has shown you shows the existing elevation above, the proposed below from Washington Street. The reference to scale that Bill just made, holding the 65-foot height of the north corner of Washington Street. We feel like this project needs to play a very important role both on the block and in this greater context. Repairing the corner of the historic fabric, holding the corner in a strong fashion, both from Washington, and this is the Perry Street elevation. Perry Street, looking from west on the left to east on the right, shows across the street apartment building over here, and then as you follow all the way to Greenwich Street on the far east, you see an existing four-story garage building. Our building matches the height of the garage building, and in terms of the conversation that Bill started about precedents for window openings, scale, and nature, our building takes its cue not just from the building to the east on the same block, but from buildings that Bill pointed out all over the neighborhood. These are two elevations. The left, Washington Street to East Perry Street, shown in greater detail, blown up. The elevation on the left shows the apartment building more clearly with the townhouse adjacent. The apartment building's front door is on Washington Street. The townhouse has a secondary entry shown here on the street on Washington, and the elevation on the right shows the front door on Perry Street. The details and the nature of materials and the layering that Bill started to speak about, I'm going to go into greater depth in following slides. This is a rear elevation viewed from the donut, from the backyards, showing on the left the townhouse and on the right the apartment building. This slide starts to show views from opposite sides of the street looking up, and illustrates how preponderance of the equipment and bulkhead is obscured as you stand. I'm not sure if you can read, but the view on the left is actually a section through Perry Street. So you're standing on the south side of the street looking north, showing that the view of all the equipment on the roof is obscured. The other two views are sections through Washington Street, looking from the west-east. Again, only the top part of the bulkhead is visible. The rest of the pergola and mechanical structure is largely obscured. The layering to which Bill referred is really part of the essence of this architecture, and this diagram starts to show how the apartment on the left and the townhouse on the right start with a stone base and kind of initiate a masonry outer layer, which is double-wide brickwork opened at the corner to create a brick screen, allowing people to view this intermediate layer, which is a layer of gardens, behind which is a layer of bronze windows that have in that same layer custom terracotta work. And immediately behind the bronze windows is a layer of custom wood louvers, which provide privacy to the inside and also to the street. So this series of layers is intended to both give the architecture a sense of richness, but also to break down the scale and introduce a kind of layering of history back to the neighborhood. The buff brick that's on the outer layer, the terracotta on the inner layer acknowledge the color and materiality of the neighborhood. The metalwork as well is something that we really wanted to honor, and we'll get into that in slightly more detail. This is a plan view of the same layering shown from the outer layer of masonry. The intermediate layer of garden space is more easily legible, and then the bronze and terracotta behind. Looking at the project from Perry Street looking east, the existing site is shown on the right and the proposed on the left. You begin to see the way this building aspires to knit itself back into the neighborhood. This is the same view blown up, so you can see it up close. The existing trees are shown. The streetscape is shown as it currently exists. And you begin to see the layering that I referred to. At night, the layers start to take on a little bit more of a different type of reading, where the brick screen has a very slight lightness to it, which could be a very appealing feature on the facade. where we're holding the corner but not doing it in a very heavy way. I'll keep going. The view from the south looking north on Washington Street begins to give you a glimpse on the right, the existing, on the left proposed, a glimpse of the proposed entry to the main townhouse. And this again enlarged, and this by night with the foreground cleared away. The idea is that the entry front door and the adjacent garage are very much understated. A quiet, subdued entry. The garden space, which I'll get into in greater depth, that's immediately to the left, it is visible to the neighborhood as an amenity. Looking from, now this is Perry Street looking west, from east, you glimpse the building on the corner. Looking now on Washington Street north to south, the apartment building is in the foreground, again existing to the right, proposed to the left slide. The apartment building is shown now where you see the secondary layer of wood louvers behind the glass, and the apartment building in greater detail now shown in this slide, where we take you down to the streetscape and you see the architecture as the passerby. The front door, the planters, the detailing of the facade, all in bronze plate, cast bronze and custom bronze detailing, really offered back to the street as a highly detailed, highly considered composition, with just above it the louvers behind the glass. The architecture of the apartment building is designed as a series of simple bronze windows that sit on expressed spandrel panels. The spandrels are expressing the floor plates of each floor. The floor-to-ceiling glass avails us of the opportunity to optimize light to within a through floor plate, but the wood louver system provides privacy and a sense of warmth to the street. This slide further down Washington Street begins to show the planting and green trees and all such in this large planter offered back to the street. And passersby are walking by the granite base, which really learned from the different building bases that Bill had shown you from the neighborhood. As you turn the corner onto Perry Street, the brick screen in detail starts to really reveal the garden space behind, and this is really an enrichment of the brickwork, which we have really gone out of our way to research. I'll show a slide in greater detail shortly, but the brick, as with the granite, as with the bronze and the terracotta, is something that's been carefully considered as a material that both learns from the buff brick of the neighborhood and then tries to take it and make it something custom and very special. As you continue on Perry Street, the front door is a composition again of bronze set back from the brick. The brick all double wide, substantial, detailed with a high level of consideration both around the window openings and at the lintels. The bronze work obscures the garage door, offers a highly custom front door with layers of fluted glass and cast bronze detail. When I was alluding to materials, each one of these materials has been a real labor of love in terms of research and trying to find something that could both honor the past and the context and then bring it to a level where we feel like it really is an architectural contribution. The image at the lower left is from our visit to a handmade brick plant in Denmark after searching for local brick makers who could achieve a variegated brick and texture. Oh, thanks. We happen to have some bricks here. We wound up conceding to, thank you, conceding to having to go abroad for these. The granite is going to be hand-worked images of that on the right. The bronze window system, something we're hoping to work with a local manufacturer, but bronze with the wood louvers behind shown on the left. Bill just very graciously propped up some of the custom terracotta pieces. We actually surveyed the brick color of the immediately adjacent buildings and have been working with Boston Valley to develop a custom terracotta pattern for this project. The bronze is the cast bronze that we're working with Polish Talix on the right, and the bronze piece on that little sample board that Bill propped up shown there as well. Just segueing from the building to its context, the lower left slide shows a site plan of the existing building. There's a very important courtyard immediately to the northeast of our project. Before we embarked on this project, we worked closely with Ed Hollander, a landscape architect, on researching the existing courtyard and its very important maple tree. Ed very graciously came with us this afternoon to speak on behalf of the landscape design and specifically on all of the existing plant material and the proposed. The the image on the lower right illustrates our proposed scheme, which shows both an expanded rear yard, which is contiguous with the adjacent yard to the northeast, opening up views for them to the south, and adds those internal and external gardens shown in the lower right. The two upper slides, upper left and upper right, are previously approved schemes from 2008 and 2009. The one in the upper left shows a seriously reduced gardens size, and the one on the upper right a similar size. This is a plan view on the left at ground floor level and at the right at roof level, which begins to illustrate the extent of the green space that we're planning to offer in this project, and Ed will speak to that in greater detail in 1 second. I'm going to end on this slide and give both Ed and Nat Oppenheimer of Silman Structural Engineers a chance to speak. This slide illustrates the view from the courtyard to the northeast to which I referred. The image on the left, looking from north to south, shows the existing building. The one on the right shows what we're proposing, and you can see the extent to which we're opening up views and daylight to the south. The tree right here, center stage, is the very important maple to which Ed will speak in a second. And Ed will be speaking about the landscape and Nat about our structural proposal. Thank you. You want to do the next? You want to just the right? Okay.
Good afternoon. I'm Edmund Hollander from Hollander Design Landscape Architects. Normally there aren't alerts that go off when I come up to talk to people, but I hope. If there's a Hippocratic oath of landscape architects, it should be to do no harm, particularly to trees that are part of the urban forest. We spent a fair amount of time actually in the courtyard looking at this tree and looking at the impacts on this tree potentially. The good news is that because we're not changing the exterior wall, we should not be impacting the root system of this tree in any way. As a Norway maple, it's a tough urban tree and something that we felt was important as part of our overall task as our landscapes really wanted to fit into the urban forest of the West Village. What we looked to do very quickly and very simply was to enhance that urban forest context in the West Village. We're adding about 1,900 square feet of green space within this project. We've got a couple dozen different types of trees depending on where they are and the particular requirements of what they need to grow. But most importantly, we wanted it to blend in and be appropriate within the feeling and context of the backyards of the West Village that we see here. We will be preserving all of the street trees. We'll be actually be enhancing the tree pits because several of them right now are growing out of those tree pits, so we'll be opening that up a little bit to improve the root zone of those trees. We'll be doing a fairly extensive amount of planting at ground level, at mid-levels, and actually on the roof of the building by adding about 1,000 square feet of planting, which will help to absorb runoff, almost serve as rain gardens, which city to help deal with some of our stormwater flows. But there are really just two main points. One is to try and design a landscape that would be an improvement and compatible with the West Village urban forest that's here, and to have a backyard garden that would also fit in with the context of the gardens we typically find in this neighborhood.
Nat Oppenheimer from Silman. I'm going to speak very briefly about the structural system, and I'll use this diagram for 1 second. This project, the client and the architects and everyone actually listened to a lot of the saber rattling we've all done in terms of neighboring buildings and the impact on them. The raised first floor that you saw in some of the architectural images has afforded us the ability to avoid underpinning on all sides of this project. The current cellar, if I can make this work, well, it follows, it's inside the line of the east walls, so that what you end up with throughout the site is basically benching details adjacent to all neighboring properties. And on a few locations where we need to dig a little deeper for pits, we've done it inboard of the project with controlled sheeting. The client has brought in the best CM in the city, in our opinion, already onto the project, and they've brought in direct subcontractors as almost a design build, so that this isn't just going to be let loose to the lowest bidder on this item. So it's been a huge point of emphasis on the project, and I can tell you right now, almost complete with design, no underpinning and no work that we feel in any way infringes on the neighboring foundations, including the gardens for the most part. Thank you.
No better place to end than with Nat. I hope we haven't spoken too much, but we wanted to show you how much thought has gone into this.
Thank you. Are there any questions for the team right now? Okay, why don't we take testimony? Glenn Umberger.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and Commissioners. I'm Glenn Umberger from the New York Landmarks Conservancy. The Conservancy's Public Policy Committee has reviewed this proposal and thanks the architect and project team for their very clear and thorough presentation. The overall height and bulk of the building fits the context of the block successfully. They follow the street wall on both frontages and fill the gap in the block fronts created by the non-contributing two-story garage. The choice of materials, both the bronze and the pale yellow brick, are unusual choices for the West Village. While there is a rich mix of materials in the district, these facades would stand out. The combination of the non-contextual building materials with the assertively incompatible design of the elevations gives us pause. While we believe that both buildings are carefully and exquisitely detailed, and although the architect said that he found inspiration in the historic buildings of the district, we fail to find the proposed appropriate in terms of design, materials, or color palette. The corner building, while appropriate in height, has facades that are designed in grand scale that makes the adjacent four-story row house on Perry Street tiny by comparison. The masonry openings are out of scale with their surroundings. By contrast, the doorway on Perry Street is so modest as to be obscure. It bears no relationship to the architecturally prominent entrances that are prime stylistic features of traditional Greenwich Village houses. The six-story building on Washington Street is designed to contrast rather than harmonize with the adjacent historic buildings. The large bronze windows are once again out of scale with their neighbors. The metallic window wall facade is not in keeping with the special historic character of the village. Therefore, although the Conservancy finds that the proposed buildings are sumptuously designed, we do not believe they were appropriate using the usual metrics of scale, design, materials, and color palette. Thank you.
The next speaker is Glenn Coleman.
Thank you for distributing those. My name is Glenn Coleman. I'm so glad to hear the project's presenters refer to the courtyard as, quote, very important. It's very important to me because I live at 340A West 11th Street, a pre-Civil War rear house set inside the large courtyard of the Washington West 11th Street Cooperative. I am also a member of the co-op's board of directors. Our co-op is just north of the 145 Perry Street site. It is home to 40 families living in 5 smaller 19th century buildings ringing the courtyard, whose central feature is a 55-year-old Norway maple tree with a magnificent canopy that defines this treasured community space. Our courtyard shares its south wall with the proposed development site. While we know that LPC is primarily responsible for the street-facing portion of such a development, we respectfully submit that our courtyard, which LPC has itself deemed iconic in deliberations on past proposals for the Perry Street site. It is not, in fact, a backyard, but is the front-facing environment for our building. To reach the front door of 340A West 11th Street, my neighbors and I must, and we love that we must, pass through a horse tunnel on West 11th Street to enter into the expanse of the unusually large courtyard. You can see that experience on page 3 of the report. Over the years, the courtyard has become a center of village life. Celebrations such as weddings, memorials, Halloween and children's birthday parties, book readings, and other community gatherings. So the impact of the back structure and expanse of the proposed development affects residents and our broader community of neighbors, as much as, if not more than, the street impact on Washington and Perry Streets. We agree with the objection to the exterior design raised by such organizations as the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation and fellow neighbors. But we want to add specific concerns about the height and the intrusion of the development onto the courtyard. While we vigorously applaud owner Stephen Cohen's wanting to open up new garden space to the rear of the property, the fact is that instead of increasing sunlight, this 80-foot tall structure built on 703 711 Washington will negatively impact the quality of this unique West Village courtyard space. The rear house and the light and views for 80 windows from surrounding buildings that face onto the courtyard. The Washington West 11th Street Owners Company commissioned a shadow study, copies of which you have in front of you. You can see for yourselves, especially on pages 8, 9, 10, and 11, that from March to September, spring-fall equinox, the courtyard will receive 20% less total sun. On the summer solstice of June 21st, 5% less sun, and on the winter solstice, 40% less sun.
I'm sorry, your time is up.
All right, thank you. We urge that you look at the negative impact. The proposed 6-story apartment tower now intrudes in the courtyard by 10 feet, while its rear could instead be built flush with the existing building of 713 Washington, or at a minimum, the intrusion reduced to no more than 5 feet. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Sarah B. Knappman.
Sarah B. Knappman, Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation. While the height and size of the proposed new buildings is in keeping with surrounding buildings, the design is not. The south building appears fortress-like, and in spite of its relatively modest scale, imposing and forbidding. The granite base with slit-like windows, the double-height cut-out wells, and the deeply indented entrance all make the building seem like a moated castle rather than engaging with the street, as is more common in this district. The plantings, beginning about 6 feet above street level, would contribute to the feeling of a pedestrian being dwarfed by the building, in spite of the street wall being only 4.5 stories, albeit a relatively tall 4.5 stories. The imposing and somewhat institutional quality of the building gives the feeling of a museum, bank, or even a high-end retail store in Miami or Los Angeles. But none of those references quite make sense for this neighborhood, where the architecture tends to be simple with charming and accessible detail. The north building has a very different but equally inappropriate character. The broad expanses of glass set within the bronze frame might make sense for an updated version of a cast iron loft building, but cast iron loft buildings are not characteristic of this area or district. While there are commercial and industrial buildings here, they are all masonry and have a very different quality than what is proposed. The proposed designs for both buildings use handsome materials and have some thoughtful and interesting details, but the design misses the mark in terms of a compatible and appropriate addition for this corner in this district. We know that there is a skillful design team behind the proposal. We believe that with the right direction from the commission, they can come up with a design that makes sense for this site. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Jordan Chaps.
Chaps, S-C-H-A-P.
Yes.
Like cowboy chaps. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jordan Chaps, and I am the founder of the Perry Street Crusaders, the organization that joined with the West 11th Street Block Association, the Village Vigilantes, and the Jane Jacobs houses to fight the original hotel that was to be on that property that subsequently led for rezoning of that area for residential. Now, it bothers me that we stopped a 100-room hotel from going in, but we now have a building that's the size of a 100-room hotel. And I hope you realize it's the yellow brick building that's the main mansion, and it's the small red brick building next to it that's the apartment house. It's not the other way around. This is ego and hubris at its worst. I'd like to address what the architect said. I wish I were a trial attorney. I'd pick it apart piece by piece. The only thing I can say is that their use of architectural references from the neighborhood is akin to saying if you took Angelina Jolie's lips, and you took Miley Cyrus's eyes, and you took Jennifer Aniston's hair, and you took Marilyn Monroe's bosom, and Heidi Klum's stature, you'd have a beautiful woman. Doesn't work that way. This building is taking advantage of the historic charm of the village and not giving back to it, not engaging with it. The only thing I can say is that, yes, there are yellow brick buildings in the village, historic buildings, West Beth for one. That doesn't mean we need or want another one. It's Greenwich Village, not Greenwich Beverly Hills. It's not Greenwich Westchester. It's Greenwich Village, a village. This has nothing to do with a village. And the only thing I can say is that I was once offered a job in the Empire State Building. I was 23 years at New York Magazine, it's another story. And the guy who interviewed me said that one of the virtues of coming to work for his company was when I would look out of my office window, I wouldn't have to look at the Empire State Building. That's what this is. The people who are going to live in this building are going to have no context with the neighborhood. They're not going to smell the linden trees on Perry and Washington. They're not going to go sit in Abingdon Square Park. They're not going to run along the waterfront. They're going to come and go in their limousines and live in their house. And they're going to look out of their windows and see beautiful, charming Greenwich Village.
Thank you. The next speaker is Kelly Carroll.
Kelly Carroll, Historic Districts Council. HDC approached this application conceding that the existing garage has little chance of survival. We lament losing historic fabric. After the passage of 50 years, we feel that the building there now adds an attractive patina and layer of history to the district, as opposed to how it was viewed 50 years ago when it was first designated, when it was only a 20-year-old building. The LPC should keep this in mind when assigning labels to buildings in future historic districts, as the throwaways of today may often become the charm of tomorrow. Regarding the proposed new building, HDC finds its materials refined and its overall concept original. The issue here is scale and proportion. While this design choice has decidedly retreated from resembling the typical row house style or scale found in this district, this building still appears to be quite large for a house, with its granite water table nearly human height. Conversely, if this conception is taking cues from larger scaled warehouse buildings in its vicinity, it still falls in its proportions, as the double height fenestration is an exaggeration of scale. Both the larger industrial buildings and the smaller residential ones in the area achieve harmony in their respective scales because of proportionate window openings, massing, and other features. Simply put, the architectural elements proposed for this building are too big for the cube that they occupy. HDC requests that these details be refined, and we would look forward to seeing the next iteration at a future public meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any more speakers on this item? No, the speakers, let's see, Community Board 2 recommends approval of the footprint and massing of both the townhouse and the apartment building, and denial of the building design as presented due to the overall monumentality of the townhouse design and lack of historic district contextuality in both the townhouse and the apartment building. Would the team like to respond to issues that were raised?
Thank you, and I will keep this brief because we have done our very best to explain to you the thinking that went into this design. At the risk of generalizing too much, I just want to say that I think what we're hearing here is a fundamentally different conceptual approach to how you can be appropriate in a historic context, particularly one that has as much variety as this one does. It is not a situation, particularly here, that a new building, to the degree that it moves away from feeling like a row house or a tenement building, the needle begins to go into negative territory. That is not what appropriateness is about, particularly in a context like this one. And we've thought very carefully about this, and we hope that the commissioners will agree. Two other very brief points. I started this presentation talking about the fact that we did not conceive these buildings as having the facade be identical with the outermost plane of the building. Many buildings in New York, not just in Greenwich Village, have a depth of facade and things going on in different ways at different levels of that depth. That, we think, is architecture and something out of which architecture can be made. And we feel that it's important to read a building that is designed that way in the way that it was designed. There are large openings in the masonry plane of the facade of the residence. Those openings are not out of scale with large openings found elsewhere, but they are, of course, large openings. But please look at the entirety of the facade, which includes many, many smaller scaled, more human scaled elements that are part of it. It is not appropriate to read a piece of the facade and not the rest of it. Just finally, we have done our very best to design the landscape aspect of this building, not only the landscaping that is part of the building, of course, but the very important landscaping that is part of the rear yard. We believe we have respected that landscape, not only in its character, but in its openness, and also, I think from a very practical point of view, the commission has approved previous approaches to landscape, which in many ways left less of the landscape open and showed less thoughtful concern than this one does. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions for the team? Any questions? All right, we can then close the hearing. All right, comments? I don't mind going first, and I'm curious what other commissioners will say, but I think the design is quite marvelous, and I think it fits in with this corner. I think that we've heard testimony as well as from community board that I think in general the massing, I think probably we can all agree is contextual and appropriate. So then it's about the design of the building, which is really what people have commented about. And just some of the thoughts I had is that this is on Washington Street. Washington Street is the edge of the district. It has a different context, and it has a mix of buildings that include industrial buildings as you go further north. It has garage buildings, as we've seen. The existing building on the site is an industrial sort of utilitarian building. And it has residential buildings, and it has other buildings like loft buildings with different window sizes. So I was actually quite persuaded by some of the analysis they had shown us regarding the context and why a building with this design approach could work. I think that it's a comment that Fred made before about, I myself don't want to design a building and say do this and do that, so I'm just thinking of this building overall, and I think I can support this notion of a layered approach to it. And I think that they've shown that they've really, while the facade may have broad strokes, which is it's a cube and it has punched openings or big openings, there's a lot of details within that that I think reflects some of the textures of the neighborhood. So I also think that the fact that the site is broken up into two buildings also adds to breaking down the scale. So I think it's a very intriguing design, and probably at a location within Greenwich Village where it could work and be an asset to the district. Yes, Fred.
I think we're having an afternoon lesson in, like we did this morning, on what is context and what is contextual design, and how far can that be stretched from what is normally thought of as contextual design. This morning's example for me was an instant kind of singing of yes. I think that this is slightly less convincing to me, but nonetheless, I think, and I have to say it is troubling, this continuation of the trend that we see in the village. Too bad the village has gotten so popular that all the billionaires need to make mega mansions here. But that's not our purview. The question here is scale, and is this being handled in a contextually appropriate way? Insofar as the overall scale, I think several people have suggested that it's acceptable. I think, Meenakshi, you just said it as well, and I agree with that. So then the question is the division here into two buildings. Perversely somewhat, the big one is the private house and the little one is the apartment house, but I'm not sure that's relevant to our conversation necessarily. It's very inventive, almost overly inventive perhaps, but inventive. The scale of the openings, this layering idea, the big double height openings, holes revealing the building behind it, is a little worrisome. I wonder what other commissioners are going to say. Is there a context where such large openings in a residential building exist, and is that an appropriate response? The unusual brickwork at the corner, in my judgment, doesn't need to find any similar kinds of expression anywhere. It's an interesting and design in and of its own self, and I think it can stand alone. So I think I'm close to being able to approve it with this certain reservations that I've just expressed.
Other comments? Yes, Adi.
So if you don't mind going to page 14. Thank you. I have to firstly say that usually I can imagine sort of anything drawn in reality, and for some reason I'm having the hardest time actually imagining the quality of this place, of this new design. I don't know what it would feel like on the street. I don't understand sort of who it's for, how the neighborhood lives with it. It's very hard for me to understand it, but I'm going to try. I'm trying. So, but what's most interesting to me is trying to figure out why it is that it's hard for me to understand this, and why it is that I can understand, for instance, the 2009 approved building. I mean, it's this, let's say it's almost the same volume, almost, and yet it reads, and it reads as something that wouldn't be jarring. We would understand it. And so, is it just because we're used to the idea that there should be 4 or 5 stories occupying that kind of height? Perhaps. I think that's part of it. It's also the issue of the verticality of the corner. You know, what's happened here is that the new design takes the horizontality of the one-story existing or 1.5-story existing volume and assumes that it can grow as a horizontal element. So the existing piece right now runs horizontal, right? And the thinking is that it can remain that kind of horizontal and grow really what are 5 stories articulated as 2 stories because of the oversized windows. And I just don't think that jump it actually can happen that easily. I mean, so the simplest thing in my mind would be to look at the new design and to think, is there a way to sort of break up that horizontality with simply a vertical line somewhere in it, which, let's say, corresponds to the 2009 vertical where the kind of the building on the corner ends? Would that start to kind of give it a scale that related to something, to the otherwise 5-story building, to the corner, to the rest of the neighborhood, maybe? So that's my first sort of step at getting towards this, but I think that my problem with it is that it makes a leap that somehow loses a step from the 1-story existing building today and its kind of entire horizontal dimension, and pulling that up. I'm not being entirely clear, but maybe someone else can follow.
All right, other comments?
I love the fact that you went to page 14, because for me, now I'm having the exact opposite response than I had in the morning. To me, when I look at what we approved in 2008 and 2009, and then I look at this, I feel like this is very refreshing. And, you know, whether it's for one person or more people, I'm looking at it as a building. And what's happening in the village is happening in the village. This is the neighborhood that it's happening in. I mean, you walk through the neighborhood and you see it, and we deal with it all the time. But what I am really struck by, to me, this is, and I think I'm echoing some of your sentiments, this is an incredibly thoughtful, interesting approach to taking a building and knitting itself into the neighborhood in a way that speaks to so many aspects of the neighborhood. The historic aspect of it, and some of the more modern elements of the building, post-war elements of the building, because it's a mixed neighborhood. And I find that what they've done with the facade is quite incredible, because by creating those punches, they've actually taken away bulk, this sense of bulk. And with the delicate work at the end, it seems to be, and we'll see what would happen in reality, but I feel like it helps make it also a little more porous, and there's an opportunity for light to radiate both ways. I like the fact that the materials are, I don't have a problem with the yellow brick, and I like the fact that the other materials work to harmonize with it and create a sense of warmth. At the street, it seems very open to me, and I like also the greenery. So it seems very accessible to me, and it works with the neighborhood. The fact that nobody's really said too much about the other building, to me, speaks well of it. Although I happen to think it's very appropriate and also a nice contemporary rendition of an apartment building, and And again, I like the materials and I like the way it communicates with this project, so, with this building. So I like it very much.
Yes,
I guess I'll be you on the first one. I really would like to have liked it, or felt that it was appropriate. My liking it doesn't really matter, but I don't. And I've been thinking about and listening to everyone else's conversations about why it is that I don't think that it's appropriate. And I buy Bill Higgins's general analysis, and I've been looking at the examples and what I know of the village. And I'm trying to identify why it is I think this agglomeration of motifs that one can assign to a source doesn't seem to add up to something that feels appropriate to the village. And I think the only thing I can think of that seems to work, and I'm not positive, is the arrhythmia of it, the kind of dysrhythmia of it. It's, if you look at all the examples that were given, or almost all of them, they fall into one of two categories. Either they're very rhythmic, boom, 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 regular buildings, whether those are federal period townhouses or loft buildings. They're very stolid, straightforward, unrhetorical, even buildings, either in a kind of industrial Beaux-Arts manner or in a federal manner. Or they're industrial buildings. They're kind of non-designed, anti-design buildings where they put a window where they needed one. This building doesn't fall into either category for me. And when I look at it, it's the kind of the lack of orderliness that seems to want to say that it's more industrial in its origins, similar to like a garage building that's been adapted as a residence. But it has some kind of order, but it's a very particularized, localized, fetishy kind of order that's associated with an asymmetrical artistic composition that doesn't seem to be appropriate to the neighborhood, in my opinion. I think that I also wanted to look at it from another point of view, which is in recent weeks and months, we've had a couple of projects where we've talked about this area of the village being the location for garages, okay? And that garages were part of the nature of the district in this area. In one case, we said, well, the project under consideration on that particular day was not in that area, so therefore the demolition of that garage was okay because it was an anomaly, right? And in another case, we celebrated the garaginess of the area and decided to encourage or permit an addition on top of it and a renovation of it. Actually, in two cases, that was the case. Here, and I know that this was approved for demolition, and it's certainly not a remarkable garage, but I think that it certainly kind of gave me a little bit of pause to think that we were letting it go in its entirety, and that made me think of what Adi was saying, which is that maybe a way to have looked at this building was that it was trying to extend, modify, play with the industrial identity of the building that was there originally. In which case, I think I agree with Adi that it kind of lost that. I mean, I think there's a lot of really beautiful motifs here, a lot of beautiful materials. I just think that the way that it's disposed is episodic, and I think that might lie behind some of the testimonies, reaction, not to the volume, not to the mass, but to the design. And for me, I think that's translating into the arrhythmia of it. The monumentality is there in the district, but again, it was kind of in industrial buildings, which had a different scale to them. This is definitely of the scale of residential buildings. It just doesn't have that feel of the scale of an industrial building. I'm rambling, and I apologize, but I don't. It doesn't feel right to me. The apartment building, quote unquote, does feel like it's more appropriate to another district. I don't think it stands out here because it's quiet and it's regular and it's got a kind of scale that's appropriate. I wouldn't say that it's striking me as a wonderful addition to the district, but I think it would pass the appropriateness test.
I think one thing to just think about in terms of exploring this, because this is a design concept, right? Yes, there are other approaches. You could take a much more conventional approach. And
We see two up there.
right, you see them, and they're fine. And I do sometimes, think about designers who are working in historic districts who probably want to do maybe a few things. One is express their own sort of interest in architecture and their own vocabulary, and also within a setting which has its own language. And how do they bridge that? I think the other sort of, and how should we as a commission think about designers, architects, owners exploring opportunities within historic districts? And how do we also ensure protection of these historic districts? I think the other interesting question is that it's more, and I think, I'm not saying that the commission must think this way, but we've heard testimony about, sort of, this is a residential building and it's a single-family home, and what's being proposed over here. And so a question is, does the inside and the outside have to have such a clear nexus? We see people living in loft buildings, and so lots of manufacturing buildings are adopted for living spaces. So I don't believe that necessarily this has to embody the residential language because it's a single-family home. I think one can break away from that, and I think one can explore motifs and vocabulary and features that you see in other typologies, even if it's being occupied by one family. But just on the issue that you talked about, which is not entropy, what was the word that you used? Arrhythmia. Okay, so dysrhythmia. I don't know what that was referring to, kind of the disorder, the order, because I think there's a lot of order to it.
It's got many orders, and I think that's kind of the problem. It seems like it's got a lot of localized orders that don't relate either to context or to the rhythms of the district. It's very episodic in the organization. I mean, there is a grid, and it does make a certain logical sense. It's not a Jackson Pollock facade, but I think for me, it just doesn't feel right to the district, which has several typical qualities of rhythm and order. And I'm not expressing it very well, but this isn't fitting into those norms. Not that you can't do something different, but for me, this feels different wrong as opposed to different right.
Yes, Kim.
I kind of agree with what Michael said, in that it's something like a factory building, or something like a German modern building, or it could even be something like a Corbusier building even. But that kind of building doesn't really fit into the village in that it doesn't interact with the street. It's like it really isn't interacting with pedestrians on the street. And I understand, yes, it's a one-family house, so you might not want to do that. But since it has so much frontage, and it's on a prominent corner, and it's just not quite interacting with the street, and you're going around, you have holes in it, but they're not holes that anybody could go into. And again, I see it's that contradiction between the architecture they want to use and the use that's in the building.
Well, I thought some of the things that they photographed that they showed us, which was both, the residential typology often has stoops and rusticated bases. They actually showed loft buildings also having that. So, at least for me, I thought that how they treated the ground floor could draw from, from buildings that are within this district. Yes.
Earlier, the first project we saw this morning was chateau-esque style, and I think it's important to recognize that maybe we're dealing with a new typology entirely. This is not new for this area. This is not a residence. it's a chateau. I mean, it's another typology. So the question is then, is it our role to approve as appropriate or not a typology? Because, and which typology is the integration of, you can say, style and use, and is that sort of outside of our purview to reject it if we were to want to? Because otherwise, let's consider this as a chateau, and that all of a sudden starts to make some sense, maybe.
Well, it's interesting because one of the buildings that is, it's on West 12th Street at the corner of, I think it's Greenwich and 12th, is one of these modern chateaus. It's something that was approved by the commission, which is a single-family home, but its scale is very different and more like a loft building. Dana?
Yeah, I agree with many of the comments that are being made, and I'm sort of trying to come at it from my own direction. I like the materials, the layering, the texturing myself. The scale of the floors, to me, is not at all residential. And when I was looking at it, I was sort of thinking if I were walking by it, it would be as though I were walking by an art museum, perhaps. Because I started trying to think of what is this typology. It's not industrial, it's not residential, but maybe it could be a museum or something. So to step back for a minute and say, well, if we don't care about the use, whether it's a townhouse or it's residential, does the presentation of what it is that presentation, that's what we're all kind of struggling with, appropriate to the district? So I imagine it's an art museum, and you think it's an industrial building, and you're thinking of a chateau, but does the way it's presenting in the district, does it seem to be appropriate to that historic district? Or might it be appropriate to some other historic district because of its character? But anyway, I do agree that I think we're kind of struggling with, well, to use the typology, what is the typology? As I said, I kind of look at it and say, well, I can imagine it as an art museum. So then I would ask us, would we approve an art museum like this in Greenwich Village, if that's what it was?
Yes, of course.
I just want to say that if we look at, some of the buildings that they laid out here as examples for us, and I'm just going to move to pages 11, yeah,
Right, if you look
7
at those ones,
Washington, 12.
Page 12, yeah.
I mean, to me, it speaks to elements of these, and with greenery popping out and different kinds of on the 727 Washington.
It doesn't hang together, is your problem?
Look at the windows or not at the top, and I think this is I think we're actually speaking to ourselves about very important questions. This whole typology question, but to say that this doesn't work, to me, is us struggling with, the sense of, what is it? What is the typology as opposed to, does it fit? And is it appropriately done? And is it appropriate to the neighborhood? So I'm just coming
agree.
back again.
But
That it
77,
doesn't have to be, I think it is whether it fits and whether it's appropriate, and, we can struggle with the typology, but there are other aspects, and I think it was good to sort of point out some of these pictures, because I think it does it speaks to various parts of this, larger windows, sort of, simple forms, depth, within these areas. Yes, Michael, you were going to say something. Michael? Okay.
well,
Kim, and then Michael.
okay. I was just going to say 77 Washington, it is not totally symmetrical, but it's balanced on both sides. The windows are vertical on one side and a little horizontal on the other side, but there's some organization there in that is not really showing up in the other building, our building. And besides, it has the door on it where you can kind of, you have the big door in the front and
Right, but
you're organizing, okay, this is a big factory, this is the way in.
Right, but I
And the
think
other thing
I
just
would
kind of leaves you with Swiss cheese holes in the front,
Well,
and I'm not
actually,
quite
if you
sure
look
what
at
it
their,
is.
well, if you look at the facade, it's actually quite regular. It's not Swiss cheese, at least my opinion. It's actually quite regular. It has depth. But I think the idea that, I would caution us from sort of trying to design where each, window should go, because all of us have a different opinion on where it should go. And I think we should sort of step back and think about the facades, first conceptually, because, we can look at this building, yes, it has its own fenestration. I'm not sure that necessarily means that this one should have the same kind of rhythm or the same patterns.
But not even that much so that, because this has a door and the other one has a tiny little door in that very large facade. I could, if the side wall, the long wall of the other building looked like 720, I could live with it. Where it has regular large openings, and clearly this is not the entrance, this is the side. There's an entrance around the corner or something. But it's so confusing, it has that little door all the way to the side next to the residential building, and you're like, is that the entrance to something? And then you see start seeing planters everywhere, and you're like, where is anything? And the entrance is actually around the corner. I'm just saying, it's confusing. You can't figure out what it is. It is the typology, it's the type of building, it just doesn't match.
Okay, yes, other comments? Yes.
First, there was a discussion about the issue with the water table and how large it was and forbidding and blah, blah, blah. And I would say that every rendering shows it at a different height. And so that's kind of an issue with the presentation of this thing. I am thinking in terms of dear departed colleague Paul Byard's issues with contemporary buildings that should be of their time. And I look at this building and I look at this thing, and I find this to be really almost frighteningly bland. And I come back to this building and I you've heard me say before that I think that Greenwich Village is probably the most difficult place to design a new building for. It's got to be. On the other hand, there is such an amazing amount of different materiality and different textures in the village that, for me, this building meets. I think Adi was talking about typology. I personally think that these folks have thought through and synthesized the materials from the neighborhood, and they've put it into a typology that seems to me to be somewhat self-referential. I don't look at this thing and start seeing other kinds of buildings, and ultimately I find it very successful. The apartment building is what is killing me. It looks like a 1950s Bun Shaftian Upper East Side thing, and so that's the one that I have the greatest issue with. The verticality of this thing, I think, is very nicely terminated by the band at the second floor. And so I look at this thing and I see an extremely rich and appropriate building for this location.
Yes.
I was almost there before, but I'm really there now. The conversation's been rich and enriching for me to hear, but also this picture and the one before it and the one after it, I think has convinced me that the large-scale openings, which I was questioning before, are okay. I'm okay with it, so just wanted to weigh in. I don't know where the vote stands. But
Okay, others? Yes.
I'd like to thank Bill Higgins for misidentifying the material on 132 Charles Street, which is actually Hardy cement board. And We were hoping
I
that
think it's
people
wood.
would take it for wood. We were forced by the DOB to use it there.
I'm glad you caught that.
Wrap.
I didn't like the
Okay, so, other comments? Yes, John.
You're looking at me with fear in your eyes.
Oh.
If you look back to page, if you look back to page 14, you know, I'm the person who would say that what we approved in 2008, 2009, I enjoy quite a bit and think they're very appropriate. And but as it turns out, I look at this current edition, and maybe it's because I'm not an architect, and therefore I didn't stare at it and say, does this fit a typology? What I did was I stared at it and I said, does this fit? And I really think it does. And I think that it does. I don't really care whether it's it has the right symmetry or fits a typology or matches what's going on inside of it. I just think they did a very good job with anchoring the corner of this particular block, and I'm in.
Okay, Wellington?
I think the conversation between the commissioners really helped me, made up my mind, because initially I was sharing some of what Fred said about, I was on the borderline on this one. But I think having heard the conversation, I think this is indeed could be deemed as contextual.
Okay, so I think that the majority of the commissioners will support this concept. I know, this approach. Michael, I know you had some concerns about the adjacent building, sorry, the second building, which is the. Yes.
So bland to me. So what?
Not you. Not you, Bland, but that other Bland. Yes.
Right, but I think it's just in terms of, I guess, the architect.
nicely too, so that's.
I think of it as sort of it's a companion to the corner building.
But also I'm forgetting the name, one of my favorite buildings in the city, on 12th Street, right off Fifth Avenue.
Butterfield House.
Butterfield. Think of Butterfield, it's not so different.
Right. Yes, Kim, you wanted to say something.
Oh, I just wanted to clarify. Although I'm, worried about the topography, I actually would vote for the building. I do think the building's contextual in this way. I'm just totally confused about one-family dwelling and look like a bank and looks industrial. It's a little too much for me, but it's contextual, so what can we say?
So you're saying it's supported, is that right?
Yes.
All right, I just wanted,
Actually.
okay, I just wanted to clarify that. So I think then we can go ahead and vote on this. Diana, are you the person are you okay with reading it? Okay.
But we wonder, what
But-
does it mean?
right. But I think it was helpful to have the discussion because it sort of, I think, responds to some of the testimony that was raised, which is, their sort of understanding of this and why they thought it was inappropriate, and perhaps the Commission's exploration as to why we think it is appropriate, and drawing from some of the information that the applicants provided us. So, okay.
In the matter of a certificate of appropriateness, Borough of Manhattan, 145 Perry Street, Greenwich Village Historic District. I recommend approval, finding that the existing garage building is not a building for which the Greenwich Village Historic District was designated. Therefore, its demolition will not detract from the special historic and architectural character of the historic district. that the height, bulk, and massing of the proposed buildings will be in keeping with the scale of historic apartment buildings within the historic district on Washington and Perry Street, and with modern apartment buildings outside the historic district on the west side of Washington Street. That locating the new apartment building at the north of the site will allow for a contextual transition between the similarly scaled apartment buildings to the north and the new large townhouse at the corner. That the design of the new apartment building, consisting of a bronze structure set slightly back from the street wall with wide bronze frame projecting window openings separated by bronze spandrels, will be a modern interpretation of tall mid-block apartment buildings with punched window openings typically found within the historic district. That the recessed ground floor entrance of the apartment building with a bronze paneled entrance door, decorative bronze panels, and a large bronze planter will be slightly lower than the adjacent storefronts and will be well scaled to the pedestrian experience of the street. That the design of the new townhouse, consisting of a light-colored handmade brick facade above a granite base with multi-story window openings with multi-light bronze windows with spandrels and monumental masonry openings with a recessed terracotta facade with multi-light bronze windows with spandrels will be in keeping with modified warehouse and other large-scale buildings found elsewhere within this and neighboring historic districts. That the brick screen facade at the corner of the townhouse will follow the acute angle of the street corner, while the interior structure will be perpendicular to Washington Street, resulting in a juxtaposition that allows the brick facade to follow the street wall on Perry Street, while the interior terracotta-clad structure relates to the traditional rectilinear design of the new and historic apartment buildings to the north. That the recessed bronze frame planters within the monumental openings along both facades and the recessed bronze framed entrance with a planter along Perry Street will allow for a connection between the large openings of the pedestrian experience of the street. That the presence of a curb cut for a new integrated garage will be in keeping with curb cuts found at garages and other industrial buildings along Perry Street and elsewhere within the western portion of the historic district. That the design of the landscape rear garden on this large cornered lot will result in the preservation and restoration of green space in the interior court. That the proposed materials and finishes, including a light beige brick, bronze framed windows with light wood shutters behind, bronze panels, terracotta panels, and granite, will be harmonious with the material and color palette characteristic of the apartment, warehouse, and modern buildings at the western end of the district. That the visible bulkheads, landscaping, and mechanical equipment, the roofs of the new buildings, will be in keeping with visible rooftop accretions found at large apartment buildings found elsewhere within the historic district, and that the light bronze finish at the townhouse bulkhead will not overwhelm the building or streetscape when viewed across lower buildings from the east along Perry Street, and that overall the corner townhouse will provide a strong, harmonious termination to the Washington and Perry streetscapes, and the apartment building will provide balance to Washington streetscape, thereby enhancing the historic and architectural character of the Greenwich Village Historic District.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? One opposed. This application's approved.
Congratulations, you guys. Nice job. I think it was on there.
We're not under, that's all that matters. Well,
That's
I
why I
have some cattle in my bag, just in case. I was just actually listening